because of, I think, what you're talking about is cosmopolitan memory, and Nazi metaphors are used very haphazardly for everything. If anybody is feeling wronged about any situation that has nothing to do with violence or anything really related to trauma at all, they will pull out a Nazi metaphor. Like something silly that comes to my head is like a grammar Nazi, you know what I mean? And for me, I feel like it so belittles the experience of people that are going through things that are similar to Holocaust victims. And I feel like, I think you mentioned that that's, I guess, one of the consequences of it. But it's, I don't know what can be done to rectify that, because at the end there's just so much, there's backlash when people do it. Like, why would you do that? That doesn't make sense. It's so crazy. But it seems like that's the only way, because it's been so mass reproduced as this is what a victim looks like, this is what a perpetrator looks like, a Nazi, Hitler, whatever, that it's just used completely inappropriately all the time. So I guess that's just a comment. Could you discuss that a little bit?
It's a good point, but as you said, it's a consequence of the awareness, let's say the globalized awareness of the Holocaust, not necessarily of Holocaust history, but Holocaust as Holocaust imagery, Holocaust iconography, Nazi iconography. It's well known through popular culture mainly. So it's something that I would say this is something which is unavoidable. Whether it's a good or a bad thing, and obviously there are bad the consequences because it trivializes the event. But and you even have it. You know, sociologists, as I said, I try to avoid the normative perspective, which means saying if it's good or bad. I'm rather interested in analyzing what the consequence is, and what it says about our culture, where we have such a big presence of the Holocaust. And I think what is interesting to think about is that those analogies are used, are incorporated, are appropriate, are re-signified by different victim groups. And we live in a time where, and this Geoffrey Hartman, who's a literary scholar in Yale, he said, we live a time that we have a new cogito. It's not anymore I think therefore I am, it's I bleed therefore I am. So meaning that having strong memories means having strong identity, and usually a memory of victimhood. So claiming victimhood is a symbolic capital. It's a tool. And that's something that we need to analyze. And of course, in that context, the Holocaust analogies come in very often.
Thank you, Edmund, for that. In many ways, it talks to what I do. But I'm just wondering, because you did stop at a place where you're talking about human rights as a new frame, and you're dealing with, as all the examples of the literature, the text that you're talking about, there is a sense of cosmopolitan, multi-directional memory, etc., all working towards the idea that this entire human rights idea is talking about right to memory as such. There's a universal phenomenon. But what is usually forgotten, and I'm wondering if this in any sense talks to you from where I come from, which is that a lot of this literature, the incredible political movements also that it has taken, the shape it has taken the human rights world, comes out of transitory regimes, mostly transitory regimes where a political battle against something has been fought, and in some semblance won. In a certain sense, with South Africa, it's apartheid, whether it's against fascism, Spain, Argentina, a certain battle has been fought and won. I'm looking at a part of the globe, whether it's the Middle East or India, where I come from, and the work that I do in both these sorts of contexts. What you have is a situation, is the right to memory actually reverses the story that you're saying, in which memory becomes the right to legitimate further violence. It's a creation of trauma rather than trauma being in the past. So what you have is in a state where an international regime of human rights cannot enter, where because of questions of sovereignty, etc., so that the political question remains inside. What happens when you're talking about not just memories which are contested? That's common to most places. Multiple groups, multiple identities, multiple memories, there's a contestation, etc. So national memories versus something else. But when you're looking at contesting memories where memory itself, that right to memory, becomes the right to legitimately violate or be the cause of civil wars, of mass violence, then the universality of the idea of human rights, of memory per se, becomes a complicated story. So I'm wondering if we need to, as sociologists, as analysts, as scholars, do we need to extend this template of comparison from transitory regimes to places where you don't have that kind of privilege, if you like, to right to memory? The claiming of victimhood is actually the legitimation for further violence. I mean, I'm thinking about India, and you have the Hindu memory of being, surpassed by centuries of the right of the people, end up being the cause by which mass violence is in a certain sense, perpetrated. So, this reversal, I'm wondering what it does to the analytic, as purely an intellectual question. And memory itself is the cause for violence rather than dealing with violence in the past. It's a temporal, it's a historical question of historiography rather than historical, but it's not a question I'm asking you to answer, but I'm just saying that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure to understand it. Who claims that right of memory in that case? In India?
It becomes a question of power. So if you're looking at the qualities which have majoritarian qualities, the group which has the majority versus the minority has the right to memory over the others. Now, that right to memory is fine, so long as it does not legitimate further violence. In the social world, that's fine, because you're talking about a place outside legality, outside democracy in a certain sense. The social world, where one group's memory becomes the reason by which the state also supports that group. Majoritarian politics, the government in power is majority party. And it's a party which is infused with that memory, that we are a victim community and that our right to memory, in a certain sense, legitimates the fact that we can violate groups of people who we believe should not exist. I mean, it comes out of things like India, Pakistan, so the entire Muslim community needs to be annihilated.
Well, but what we have there is something that is not so uncommon, which is what Todorov calls it literal memory versus exemplary memory. And that's also, I mean, the human rights discourse tries to be an exemplary memory. So that means that it's not a continuation of it's not a reinforcement of memory through continuation of identity politics and by engaging in a struggle with the enemy, because that's what he calls this literal memory that doesn't lead anywhere but to violence. So you have that, but I think if we had tried to conceptualize it, we wouldn't see that sort of literal memory within a group, not necessarily a group that has state power. It could be any group that deals with a memory of resentment and has a right to memory to construct a narrative, but that may just overflow into, might just lead to more violence. But human rights discursivity are a particular memory regime, but I would say where this exemplarity is looked for. But within that exemplarity also means universality, and within that universality the problems that this entails, which is blurring the specificity of the event. So that's what when I mentioned this problem of memory versus history, is that this particular universal memory it becomes so universal anybody can be a victim. But the actual conflicts are blurred. The actual history is blurred. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
How do collective or cultural social memories change from the generation who experiences the trauma to the next generation, children of people who experience the trauma?
How this happens?
Yeah, or like how do the memories change, or do they, or what happens?
Well, yeah, that's an excellent question that's probably researchers have to find out, because usually what you have is a notion of trauma, and trauma just maybe within the person, and since we have that concept of intergenerational transmission of trauma, means that if your parents were traumatized, you are automatically also traumatized. If you look at the discourses of the memory movement in Spain, they will construct this lineage of traumatized family. You may have it in some cases, but I don't think that the memory movement, that these are the causes that explain the memory movement. The memory movement can be explained through causes that are within politics and Spanish society over the last 20 years. I mentioned the fact that Spain becomes Europeanized, the fact that the Holocaust culture enters into the Spanish public sphere, the fact that Spain becomes a major actor in international criminal justice through people like Judge Garzón, the fact that in the 80s, 70s and 80s, the transitions in Argentina and Chile are something that the Spanish audience follow closely. So you have a change of self-understanding within individuals in a particular cohort that suddenly will think differently about their own past, about the societal past. Not just, it's not a, so I try to separate that psychological dimensions. I'm very skeptic with the use of the trauma category from a social science approach to collective memory. I would not deny those individualized factors, psychological factors, but I think that those narratives are constructed through elements that you can find in society and in a changing society, and a self-understanding of a new generation of Spaniards that think themselves as Europeans. So that's, yeah, I would say. Yeah, Amy.
You mentioned when you were talking about Hallbacks at the beginning, this idea of the collective memory frames, and that I know that a critique that he has gotten a lot is that he doesn't leave any space open for individual memory. So I was just curious as to where your stance is on this debate between collective memory and individual memory, if they can coexist, or if this idea of collective memory and the societal frames totally, totally gets rid of the idea that individual memory can even exist.
Yeah, I think that in our common sense, we have this idea of individual memory, and I think Hallbacks brings in this fundamental shift in our self-understanding of memory, and I think it goes beyond thinking of our own past and the things that happened in our past. I personally believe that thinking of ourselves as individuals embedded in social relations and groups, and our own thinking as a product of group thinking, is a very powerful idea. And I think there was this sociologist Gombrowicz that said the worst error that philosophers and theologians ever did is to believe that the man or the human being thinks. It doesn't think. It's the society who thinks through him. So I think that's what basically Hallbacks is saying, that applied to remembrance. And the exception that were dreams, but I don't know. I think it's not that it's incompatible. And he's not saying that there is no individual memory in itself. He says that our individual memory are shaped by the collective. That's what he's. So, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
So, when you talk about, I have more of a social psychological background, so sorry if I say something that is
That's good.
When we think about collective, I hear you talking about collective memory. When we talk about culture, we say that culture is just shared meaning, shared understanding. The way the collective and the culture, you cannot have the two separate. And we know that sometimes cultures change. But there are some cultures that don't change too much. If we think Jewish culture, in a way, the core is the same. So we'll go back to Exodus and the traditions. But modern societies, some other societies experience sudden changes because sometimes political regimes change and things like that. And what you see then is that cultural knowledge is, I would say more is cultural conversation. It's what's the thing that we know about ourselves that allow us to be more articulate in explaining what is important right now. And sometimes what is important right now might change. And then we might go and borrow from our history what's the cultural conversation that better fits what's important right now. And I'm trying to understand if this collective memory is really memory that is kept, or is a conversation that, as long as we don't have any cultural shift, this conversation can be linked to that particular monolithic past. But if our culture conversations start to shift because we need to accommodate a different cultural discourse, then I might have to kind of take a look at something from the past that wasn't talked about before, but is in our history. And then we go, and now that's the cultural conversation, and that is that collective memory?
Definitely. That's the essence of collective memory. When Halbach said that the present shapes the past, that also means that what we select of the past is will vary. And even if you choose the same event, you mentioned the Exodus, that event can be interpreted in many different ways. So looking at that event doesn't mean that it's monolithic, that it actually evolves. You can analyze the Exodus as a story of revolution and liberation. You can analyze it as a religious, theological implication of the bond between God and the people of Israel. So you have very different interpretations of the same past, but that's the essence of how collective memory works. The past in itself is constantly reshaped, reinterpreted, revisited, reframed. That's the essence of it. Still, yeah.
I have a question. I want to know what do you think about it. We talk about the memories of the new generations, and the relation between memory and human rights, no? And what I see, and with that comment there too, is kind of a shift, no, to new types of memories that are not, depending on the way you look at it, they're related to those human rights violations, or maybe not so much related to human rights violations. They are not going to lead to a trial, for example. If in the case of the babies that were stolen in detention centers, yes, but in the case of that generation that is just telling the story of how they felt the disappearance of the parents, more than the reparation was done, no? So then, so what is...
Like for instance, that theater play of Chilean youngsters?
Well, that would be even worse, because that would be trying to put together different memories that are in conflict.
Yes.
And claiming that this is a generation that we have a collective memory there, I'm not sure, no? Because what you see is conflict, no? But that type of memory is also in conflict with the memory of the sons and daughters of the disappeared in Argentina, for example. But also within that group, you have the group of those who were babies and where they recuperated their identity because themselves they were disappeared. Yeah. And then you have the stories of perhaps children who were in exile that don't have much voice in terms of as a generation or so. But my question points to the relation that you were making between the memory and human rights, because in that shift, it doesn't seem that the relation is so close. There is a relation to human rights, but to a culture of human rights that is not necessarily, it's not going to cause any more trials in that case.
Yes, but I would say, yeah, that's a good point. would say that human rights here, I mean, if we think of this nunca más paradigm as the slogan of human rights, of a human rights culture, or of a human rights approach to the past. So that does not mean necessarily trials. It doesn't mean, I think, human rights here is understood more than in the legal sense. It can be seen in a cultural sense. So human, and that would encompass those, also artistic or performative and street art and whatever. You have all this. You have so many different people involved in, we may say, memory activities and memory politics, but none of them are political in the sense of traditional social justice politics. So you have more so that's why I think we can apply the categories of Hirsch, of Postmemory. You have a generation that is, we can even say, I know more about the Spanish, but it's that a generation that is suddenly obsessed with the past, that look more to the past than to the future, and having this element in the past that has such an important, that has grown into such, that has become so important, is a shift, and is a shift to the generation of the transition. People didn't look back, and that has to do with another, sort of meta-narrative that you had at that time. Most of them were socialists and communists, and memory wasn't a dimension within the leftist movement. It wasn't. It was rather a conservative, reactionary element. So I think I see it more in that context. But I'm thinking about it. I'm not entirely sure. I'm thinking about these issues. We would have to delineate what are all the different phenomena that you incorporate into this human rights meta-narrative.
You were talking about the victimization of the victims, but they don't like to be seen as victims, the ones that were combatientes or militants.
But the discussion, both in Spain and Argentina.
And there are others that they see them as pure victims, right? How do you see, I wanted to know how you see this dynamics that is happening now with the post generation or the second generations that usually sees them as heroes. And if you know
in Argentina. Yeah, that's interesting.
and if you know any cases of that second generation that tries to transmit a different kind of memory, like counter memory, that they don't see them as heroes, but maybe I don't know, like terrorists, or if you know any groups or any
But in Spain?
some sort of intent of projecting a counter memory in the second generation. Like sons that you mentioned something that their parents were seniors or something like that before.
Yes.
They have to pay for their seniors.
Yes. If they feel accountable for what the parents did, should they? Yeah.
So usually, what I'm trying to say that usually the post generations or the second generations portrays them as heroes and some sort of victims, right? And they are victims too.
Yes.
But how this functions with this in front of the combatientes image, the heroes, and if you know on the other side the counter memory, something that
Yes.
acts as counter memory in this case, in this second generation. I don't know.
Yes. No, I think, yeah. But of course, you have certain memories that are more dominant in the public sphere than others. In Argentina, you have clearly, if you look at Parque de la Memoria and all the initiatives also that are done by the government, you have a certain framework that is more dominant than others. But they always have been different different groups of population that have different memories of the events. What I was mostly referring to is to a dominant human rights memory frame in Argentina and in Spain. But in Spain, for instance, you have, of course, you have conservative memory narratives that, and you have the main split, which is not so much about the past, but on the fact whether looking at the past is a good or a bad thing. So what the right will say is that this is opening wounds. And the left is saying, no, it is closing wounds. So what you basically have is a totally opposite understanding of the work of memory. Looking back is a good thing, truth, memory, justice. Looking back is a bad thing, opening new rifts in new generations unnecessarily. So that's what you have. But you have also splits within the memory movement. And in Spain, you have, for instance, you have two associations. You have the Asociación para la Recuperación de Memoria Histórica, and then you have the Foro por la Memoria, which is much more political in that sense, and I would say they're more in the no pasarán framework. And they would accuse the others of a privatization of memory, of treason towards those who are exhumed now because they were militants and they were fighting for a more more just society. You also have that in Argentina. So we have to take the struggle from where they left and continue the struggle. So they're, in that sense, more it's more a militant memory. The others have rather the human rights approach. It's not about making a big political struggle with the corpses of these people. It's just about giving them proper, exhuming them, identifying them, and have their families giving them the burial that they want. So it's more a family, let's say, human rights approach. There's no politics involved in that sense. But you cannot imagine the confrontation that you have among these different associations in Spain, and sometimes even at the site of the exhumation. Because one group will come with flags of the Republic, with communist flags, and of course they will enter into a fight with the relatives who say, this is my grandfather is here, get out with your politics. So what sort of lineage is created? Is it about a political lineage, or is it more about a family, just a genealogical issue? Who claims the right? Who claims the right to speak for those dead and to act in their name? These are memory struggles. So, you have a thing?
So my question kind of follow up that question. Since I'm a policy student, so I'm just curious to know, what do you think of people that they use this collective memory, especially like genocide and Holocaust, to legitimize their policy decision, to invoke people's hatred or against a certain group, to legitimize their policy decision? Thank you.
So, what I think, whether this is legitimate or...
Yes, so like a certain party, they will use this part of the memory, or it's just a symbol in a memory to invoke people's hatred or people's emotions against a certain group or against a certain country. And that's also a way to try to legitimize their policy decision making. So I'm just curious to know what do you think? Because they would say, okay, we have the right to, to memorize this, remember this, these are reflection, these are past, and you weren't a perpetrator back then. So they just use this to invoke the civilians' emotions, and also to further legitimize their policy decision making. So I'm just curious.
Yes, well, what I think is that sometimes you actually blur the specificity of the event, and you may not serve your cause in the best way. I would say that. For instance, we organized an event at the Center for Holocaust Genocide Studies on the crimes against the Dakota people here in 150 years ago, the expelled from the state of Minnesota. One of the presenters used image that I showed, notice any similarities. So he was trying to bring attention towards what was his message. Was he saying that what happened to the Native Americans is exactly what happened? It's like what happened to the Warsaw Jews, like with the image of the Warsaw Ghetto Boy. Maybe he was saying that. What he was saying is he's desperately claiming, he's asking for attention. And that's why he uses the analogy. The analogy has other consequences. It spurs resentment. It spurs even anti-Semitic resentment. You have it often. And obviously that's a terrible consequence. The paradox that Holocaust memory, a globalist Holocaust memory, is leading into anti-Semitic resentment. You have it in those cases. So I'm skeptical about the use of it, but particularly because I think that the true nature of the events are not really grasped. Just by using an analogy from the 20th century about a 19th century internment camp here, whatever. So the fact that it might not be a genocide, but even if it's not a genocide, the crimes are not less heinous. So that's what we need to probably to think. But here we're entering into a moral and political debate, which is a little bit to the side. Okay, well, any other questions? Well, then again, thank you very much for coming, and be careful. Drive safely. Yeah. Actually, if anybody